The most painful seat at a wedding isn't always the one in the back. Sometimes, it's the one that tells everyone exactly what your own family thinks you're worth. I never imagined that my younger sister's wedding would become the day my entire family revealed how little space they believed I deserved in their lives. My name is Claire Bennett, and until that Saturday afternoon in early June, I kept convincing myself that time could heal almost anything. Families fought. Families drifted apart. Families made mistakes. That was what I had repeated to myself during the 4-hour drive from Columbus to Asheville, watching the interstate roll beneath my tires while rehearsing polite conversations that would probably never happen. Emily had mailed my invitation 6 weeks earlier. It wasn't handwritten. There wasn't a personal note tucked inside the envelope. Just my name printed neatly beside everyone else's. Still, I treated it like an olive branch. She was my little sister. Maybe getting married had changed her perspective. Maybe she finally wanted us to become sisters again instead of strangers who happened to share a last name. The venue looked like something from a magazine. Sitting on a hillside surrounded by blooming gardens and rows of white chairs facing a quiet lake. Valets welcomed guests driving luxury SUVs and imported sedans, while staff members offered sparkling water and lemonade beneath elegant white tents. I had spent nearly $300 on a navy blue dress that felt timeless without drawing attention, paired with simple pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. Looking into the rearview mirror before stepping out of my car, I reminded myself to smile no matter what happened. It was Emily's day. I wasn't there to settle old scores. I was there because somewhere beneath years of silence, I still loved my sister. The first familiar face I spotted belonged to my mother. She noticed me immediately, paused for half a second, then forced a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Claire," she said, giving me a quick hug that felt more like checking a box than welcoming her oldest daughter. "You made it." "Wouldn't have missed it," I answered, hoping she would ask about my drive or my job or anything that sounded like genuine interest. Instead, she glanced over my shoulder toward arriving guests. "We're very busy today. Make yourself comfortable." Before I could answer, she was already walking away. My father offered a polite handshake a few minutes later, almost like greeting someone from work instead of his own daughter. Emily was surrounded by bridesmaids inside the bridal suite, so I wasn't surprised when I couldn't see her before the ceremony. What surprised me was that no one seemed particularly interested that I had come at all. Cousins greeted one another with laughter. Old neighbors hugged. Friends posed for photographs beneath flower arches. I drifted quietly through conversations that stopped just long enough for polite smiles before continuing without me. It was familiar enough that I almost laughed. Some things never really changed. Then an event coordinator carrying a clipboard approached me with a practiced smile. "Miss Bennett," she asked, "would you come with me? I'll show you to your table." Relief washed over me. Finally, something simple. Something organized. I followed her across the reception lawn, passing beautifully decorated tables near the dance floor. Then another section overlooking the lake where close relatives were already finding their seats. We kept walking, past the musicians setting up their instruments, past the dessert display, past the bar. Finally, we reached a small round table tucked beside double swinging doors marked staff only. Every few seconds, servers pushed through carrying trays of food, while the smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. The coordinator smiled warmly, as though nothing were unusual. "Here you are," she said. "This is your assigned seat." I looked around slowly. I wasn't seated with my parents. I wasn't seated with cousins. I wasn't even seated with distant relatives. I was sitting beside the kitchen, where the clatter of dishes nearly drowned out the music before the ceremony had even begun. For several long seconds, I simply stood there staring at the place carved with my name written in elegant gold lettering. There was no mistake. It was not the wrong table. It was not a last-minute adjustment. Someone had carefully planned for me to spend the evening beside the kitchen doors where every swing of the hinges released another burst of noise, another wave of heat, and another reminder that I was far from where family was supposed to sit. I forced a smile at the coordinator. None of this was her fault. She had only been following instructions. "Thank you," I said quietly before taking my seat. The chair wobbled slightly against the stone patio, and I reached down to steady it while pretending not to notice that nearly every other table enjoyed a beautiful view of the lake. Mine overlooked stacks of serving trays waiting to be collected after dinner. Guests continued arriving in tailored suits and colorful dresses. Laughter floated through the gardens as old friends reunited. Every few minutes, someone walked past my table on the way to a better one, offering a polite nod before continuing without stopping. I checked the seating chart posted near the entrance from where I sat. My parents were seated at the head family table beside Emily and her new husband. My aunt and uncle occupied another table near the dance floor with cousins I had not seen in years. Even second cousins I barely recognized were grouped together. I was the only Bennett sitting alone among people I had never met. A cheerful older couple introduced themselves after sitting across from me. They explained they were neighbors of the groom's parents and had accepted the invitation only a month earlier. They assumed I must be an old friend of the bride. I hesitated before answering. Actually, I am Emily's older sister. Their smiles froze for the briefest moment. The woman glanced toward the head table and then back at me with visible confusion. Her sister, she repeated gently. We thought all the immediate family was sitting together. I laughed softly, hoping to spare all of us from embarrassment. Wedding seating can be complicated. She nodded politely, but I could tell she did not believe my explanation. Neither did I. As guests settled into their chairs, I noticed my mother scanning the reception area. Our eyes met for an instant. Instead of looking surprised to see where I was seated, she simply looked away. That hurt more than I expected. If she had argued with the planner or questioned the arrangement, perhaps this had all been beyond her control. But the absence of surprise told its own story. She already knew exactly where I would be sitting. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily looked radiant walking down the aisle with our father. I truly meant that. Watching her smile reminded me of the little girl who used to sneak into my bedroom during thunderstorms because she believed I could keep the lightning away. Somewhere between those childhood nights and this elegant afternoon, we had become strangers. I clapped with everyone else when they exchanged vows. I smiled during the photographs. I even laughed when the flower girl nearly dropped her basket before catching it at the last second. I wanted to enjoy the day despite everything. But every joyful moment seemed to come with another quiet reminder that I was standing just outside the circle everyone else belonged to. During cocktail hour, I watched relatives embrace one another while servers carried trays through the kitchen doors only a few feet behind me. One waiter accidentally brushed my chair while hurrying inside and apologized 3 times. I assured him it was perfectly fine. He looked more concerned about inconveniencing me than my own family had all afternoon. Then I overheard 2 bridesmaids speaking near the dessert table. One whispered, "Is that really Claire?" The other answered, "Yes." Emily said it was easier this way because she did not want any awkward family drama near the front. They walked away before realizing I had heard every single word. And as I looked toward the beautifully decorated head table once again, I realized the seat beside the kitchen had never been about space. It had been a message. The words echoed in my mind long after the bridesmaids disappeared into the crowd. She did not want any awkward family drama near the front. It was such a simple sentence, delivered casually, almost carelessly, yet it explained more than anyone in my family ever had. I looked around the reception again, but this time through different eyes. The distance between my table and everyone else's suddenly felt much greater than the 30 or 40 feet separating us. It felt like years. I wrapped both hands around my glass of iced tea, hoping the coolness would steady my thoughts. There had been a time when Emily and I could not imagine spending a single day apart. Growing up in our small Ohio neighborhood, we shared everything. We shared a bedroom until I turned 13. We borrowed each other's sweaters. We stayed awake, whispering long after our parents told us to go to sleep. Whenever someone asked who Emily admired most, she always pointed at me. She wanted to attend the same college I dreamed about. She wanted to learn how to bake because I loved spending Saturday mornings making cinnamon rolls with our grandmother. She even copied the way I tied my hair before school. Somewhere along the way, admiration quietly turned into distance, and distance slowly became silence. Looking back, I could never identify one dramatic moment that changed everything. Instead, it happened through hundreds of small moments. After I graduated from college, I accepted a nonprofit position that paid modestly but gave me purpose. My parents congratulated me politely before asking whether I planned to find something with better income. A year later, Emily joined a successful real estate firm. Suddenly, every family dinner revolved around her promotions, her commissions, and her growing circle of influential friends. I was genuinely happy for her. but each holiday made me feel slightly less visible. When our grandmother became ill 5 years earlier, I took unpaid leave from work to care for her during her final months. Emily visited whenever her schedule allowed, usually bringing flowers or groceries before rushing off to another appointment. After Grandma passed away, relatives praised Emily for balancing such a demanding career while still finding time to visit. Nobody mentioned that I had been there every single day. I never expected applause. I only hoped someone had noticed. Apparently, they had not. The pattern repeated itself year after year. I became the dependable daughter people assumed would quietly handle difficult responsibilities without recognition. Emily became the accomplished daughter whose successes deserved celebration. Neither role was assigned in one conversation. They simply settled over us until everyone accepted them as normal. Even I did. A server interrupted my thoughts by placing a basket of warm dinner rolls on the table with an apologetic smile. "I hope the kitchen traffic is not bothering you too much," he said kindly. "We have been asking whether this table could be moved a little farther away." I smiled back. "Thank you. I appreciate you asking." He nodded before hurrying through the swinging doors again. His concern lasted less than 30 seconds, yet somehow it carried more kindness than I had received from my own relatives all afternoon. Music began drifting across the lawn as guests found their seats for dinner. Conversations grew louder. Glasses clinked together. I watched my parents laughing with family friends while Emily greeted table after table, accepting hugs and congratulations. Eventually, she reached mine. For one hopeful second, I wondered whether she had finally realized how hurtful this arrangement looked. Instead, she leaned down with a bright smile designed for photographers. "Everything all right over here?" she asked. "Yes," I answered honestly. "I heard what your bridesmaids said." Her smile stiffened almost imperceptibly. She glanced around to make sure nobody nearby was paying attention. Then she lowered her voice. "Claire, today is not about old feelings. I just wanted everything to stay comfortable for everyone." Before I could respond, someone called her name from across the lawn. She touched my shoulder for barely an instant, turned away, and disappeared back toward the center of the celebration. I remained seated beside the kitchen doors, realizing that she had not denied making the decision. She had simply decided that my comfort mattered less than everyone else's. I let Emily's words settle without answering. There was nothing left to argue about because the truth had already been spoken. She believed that placing me as far from the family as possible made the day easier for everyone else. Whether she realized how deeply those words cut no longer mattered. She had made her choice, and now I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be for the rest of the evening. I chose to stay. Dinner service began as the late afternoon sunlight softened into a warm golden glow across the lake. Waiters carried beautifully plated meals through the same kitchen doors that swung open beside my chair every few seconds. The aroma of grilled filet, roasted vegetables, and fresh herbs filled the air while conversations blended into a pleasant hum across the reception lawn. The guests at my table proved kind enough. The older couple continued making light conversation, asking about my work, the drive from Ohio, and whether I planned to stay in North Carolina after the wedding. Their questions were ordinary, yet they reminded me what genuine curiosity sounded like. Nobody at my own family's table had asked me a single question all day. Across the lawn, I watched photographers move effortlessly between smiling relatives. My parents posed with Emily and her husband beneath a floral arch while cousins gathered for group pictures. Every few minutes, another burst of applause echoed through the reception as someone delivered a heartfelt toast or shared a funny memory. I noticed that not once did anyone look toward the corner where I was sitting. It was almost as if I had become part of the catering equipment instead of the guest list. I quietly focused on my meal, determined not to let disappointment ruin my composure. Then something unusual happened. One of the venue managers hurried across the property, speaking into a small radio clipped to his jacket. A second manager followed close behind. Within moments, several staff members who had been calmly serving drinks suddenly began straightening table linens, adjusting flower arrangements, and checking every detail near the entrance. Their movements were efficient, but noticeably more urgent than before. Guests slowly began noticing the activity as well. Conversations paused. Heads turned toward the long driveway leading to the estate. Someone at a nearby table joked that perhaps another wedding party had gotten lost. Another guest laughed and suggested a local politician might be arriving late. Even the musicians briefly stopped tuning their instruments to glance toward the entrance. I watched one valet receive a phone call before immediately signaling to the rest of the parking team. They lined up neatly near the front gate with an attention that seemed completely out of proportion for an ordinary guest. The atmosphere shifted in subtle ways that were impossible to ignore. Curiosity spread through the reception like a ripple across still water. Emily noticed the unusual activity from the head table and walked over to the wedding planner. I could not hear their conversation, but I saw the planner's expression change from confusion to surprise. Emily frowned, looked toward the driveway, then smoothed her dress as though preparing to greet someone important. My father adjusted his suit jacket. My mother quietly checked her hair in the reflection of a nearby window. None of them seemed to know exactly who was coming, yet all of them clearly believed the arrival mattered. The murmurs grew louder as several black luxury vehicles appeared at the far end of the winding entrance road. They moved slowly, escorted by discreet security personnel who stepped out first to survey the area before opening any doors. Guests instinctively rose from their chairs to get a better look. Phones appeared in several hands, though nobody seemed certain whether taking photographs would be appropriate. The entire celebration seemed to pause in a shared moment of anticipation. Whoever had just arrived was important enough to interrupt an elegant wedding reception without saying a single word, and as I watched every eye turn toward the entrance, I had no idea that within the next few minutes the carefully planned distance between me and my family was about to become the least important thing anyone at the wedding would remember. The first vehicle came to a smooth stop beneath the circular entrance, followed by two more. The conversations across the reception faded into complete silence. Even the waitstaff paused where they stood, uncertain whether to continue serving or wait. The venue manager walked briskly toward the driveway with the wedding planner close behind, both wearing expressions that mixed excitement with nervousness. I remained seated where I was, assuming whoever had arrived had nothing to do with me. People of influence occasionally attended high-profile weddings. Emily had built an impressive professional network through real estate, and her husband worked with several charitable organizations. Perhaps one of their distinguished clients had decided to make a surprise appearance. A uniformed chauffeur stepped forward and opened the rear door of the middle vehicle. A dignified elderly woman emerged, carrying herself with effortless grace. She wore a beautifully tailored pale blue suit, a matching hat decorated with understated elegance, white gloves, and a single strand of pearls that reflected the evening light. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, yet the quiet confidence with which she walked immediately commanded everyone's attention. Several members of her staff followed respectfully a few steps behind. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to recognize her. I heard guesses ranging from an ambassador to a foreign dignitary. Someone quietly mentioned that she looked like a member of European nobility visiting the United States for a charity event. I did not pay much attention. I had seen photographs of her before, but only during international news broadcasts years earlier. Long ago, she had asked me never to make a spectacle whenever our paths crossed in public. I intended to honor that wish. At the head table, Emily hurried toward the entrance with her new husband, clearly believing the distinguished guest had come to congratulate them. My parents followed a few steps behind, smiling broadly as though they had personally arranged the visit. The wedding planner extended both hands in welcome, saying something I could not hear over the distance. The elegant woman acknowledged each greeting politely with a warm smile, but she did not stop walking. Emily attempted to lead her toward the center of the reception where photographers were already gathering. Instead, the distinguished guest thanked her with a gentle nod and continued forward without slowing down. Confused silence spread across the lawn. Every eye followed her graceful movements. She walked past the beautifully decorated head table without taking a single photograph. She passed the bride, the groom, my parents, and the waiting relatives who had begun forming a welcoming line. She acknowledged each person with perfect courtesy, yet her attention remained fixed on something farther away. On me. I slowly stood as she approached, my heart beating faster than it had all day. Nearly 8 years had passed since we last met in person. Time had added a few more silver strands to her hair, but her warm eyes had not changed at all. Before anyone around us could understand what they were witnessing, She smiled with unmistakable affection. "Claire," she said in the same gentle voice I remembered. "There you are." I smiled back despite my complete surprise. "Your Grace," I answered softly. "It is wonderful to see you again." Without hesitation, she reached forward and embraced me warmly, exactly as though greeting a cherished member of her own family. Gasps rippled across the reception. Conversation stopped entirely. The photographers who had been waiting near the dance floor instinctively turned their cameras toward us instead. I could almost feel hundreds of confused eyes searching for an explanation. The older couple sitting at my table stared at me with complete disbelief. Across the lawn, Emily stood frozen beside her husband. My father lowered his hands to his sides while my mother's expression shifted from pride to bewilderment. Nobody seemed capable of understanding why a woman whose title had been recognized across continents had walked past every honored guest at the wedding simply to greet the daughter they had quietly hidden beside the kitchen doors. For several seconds, nobody moved. The only sounds came from the soft breeze across the lake and the distant clinking of dishes inside the kitchen behind my table. The distinguished woman stepped back from our embrace, still holding both of my hands with genuine affection. Her smile carried the warmth of someone greeting an old friend, rather than attending a formal public event. "You have been far too difficult to persuade into visiting again," she said with gentle humor. "I was beginning to think I would have to come looking for you myself." I laughed quietly. "Your Grace, you have always been far too kind." She shook her head. "Kindness has nothing to do with it. Gratitude does." Her answer puzzled nearly everyone listening nearby, but I immediately understood what she meant. 8 years earlier, while volunteering through an international literacy initiative, I had been assigned to help coordinate community outreach during one of her charitable visits to the United States. A scheduling problem had unexpectedly left her private companion unavailable for several days. I had quietly stepped in, helping without ever asking for recognition, interviews, or photographs. During those days, we spent hours discussing education, service, and family. What began as a professional responsibility slowly developed into a sincere friendship built on mutual respect rather than titles. Even after the program ended, we occasionally exchanged handwritten letters and holiday cards. I had never mentioned it to anyone at home because it had never seemed important to me. Across the reception lawn, the silence finally broke as Emily cautiously approached with my parents beside her. "Your Grace," Emily said carefully, trying to regain her composure. "It is such an incredible honor that you came to celebrate with us." The elegant woman smiled graciously. "Thank you. Weddings are beautiful occasions." Emily waited, expecting more, but instead the conversation naturally returned to me. "Claire," the distinguished guest continued, "I received your last letter. I was delighted to hear about the children's reading centers your organization has opened this year. You continue making the world brighter one community at a time." I felt my cheeks warm slightly. "We have wonderful volunteers. They deserve most of the credit." She gave me a knowing smile. "You always say that." My father stared at me with open confusion. "Letters?" he asked quietly. "You have stayed in touch all these years." I nodded. "Occasionally. Mostly. Around holidays or charity projects." My mother's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Why did you never tell us?" I looked at her calmly. Nobody ever asked what I was doing. The words were not spoken with anger. They were simply true. An uncomfortable silence followed. Around us, guests listened without pretending otherwise. Some of the same relatives who had barely acknowledged me earlier now watched every word with complete attention. The older couple at my table exchanged astonished glances as they finally understood why such an extraordinary visitor had crossed the entire reception to find the woman sitting beside them. One of the members of the royal staff quietly approached and offered the distinguished guest a folder containing her schedule. She glanced at it briefly before looking around the reception. Her warm expression faded ever so slightly as her eyes settled on my isolated table beside the kitchen entrance. "Claire," she asked gently, "is this where they chose to seat you?" Before I could answer, her gaze traveled across the reception toward the beautifully arranged family tables near the dance floor. She did not need anyone to explain what she was seeing. Years of public life had taught her to notice details others overlooked. She understood immediately that this placement had not been an accident. Emily lowered her eyes. My parents remained completely silent. The distinguished woman did not raise her voice or criticize anyone. She simply looked back at me with quiet concern and asked one simple question that somehow carried more weight than any accusation ever could. "My dear," she said softly, "would you do me the honor of joining me for the rest of the evening? I would much rather enjoy dinner in your company than anywhere else." For a brief moment, I looked around the reception instead of answering. Every face that had barely acknowledged me earlier was now watching, waiting to hear what I would say. Emily stood perfectly still beside her husband. My parents seemed unable to meet my eyes. The distinguished woman's invitation had changed the atmosphere without raising a single voice. It was not about status. It was about dignity. I smiled gently. "Your Grace, I would be honored." She slipped her arm through mine with the effortless warmth of an old friend. Together we walked away from the small table beside the kitchen. No announcement was made, yet the entire reception instinctively shifted its attention toward us. One of the venue managers hurried forward and quietly instructed the staff to prepare a more suitable table overlooking the lake. Within minutes, servers gracefully relocated a beautifully decorated table to the center of the reception, ensuring the distinguished guest could be seated comfortably. Before taking her seat, however, she turned to the staff with a gracious smile. "Please do not trouble yourselves on my account," she said. "The only thing that matters is that Miss Bennett and I may continue our conversation." Several employees smiled appreciatively. They had witnessed everything from the beginning of the afternoon. Now they understood what none of them had expected. As we sat together, she asked about my literacy foundation, the families we had recently helped, and the small community libraries our volunteers had opened throughout rural counties. Her questions were thoughtful, specific, and sincere because she had followed our work for years. I answered naturally, forgetting that hundreds of curious eyes remained fixed on us. We laughed while remembering one rainy afternoon during the International Education Conference when every carefully planned outdoor event had been canceled, and we had spent hours reading children's books to local students instead. "You never complained once," she recalled with a smile, "even when your shoes were completely soaked." I laughed. "Neither did you. That is because you reminded me that children never remember the weather. They only remember whether someone showed up." I had forgotten saying those words. Apparently she had not. Around us, the mood of the reception quietly transformed. Guests who had once assumed I was an overlooked relative now whispered about the conversation unfolding before them. The older couple from my original table smiled warmly each time our eyes met, as though they were genuinely happy that someone had finally recognized what they had sensed earlier. Eventually, my father approached our table. His posture was hesitant in a way I had never seen before. "Claire," he began softly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" I excused myself politely. We stepped a short distance away from the others while remaining within sight of the reception. My father looked toward the lake before speaking. "I owe you an apology." I remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "I have been thinking about everything that happened today," he admitted. "Not because of our distinguished guest. Because I realized that none of us questioned where you were sitting. We accepted it without giving a second thought. That should never have happened." I appreciated that he did not make excuses. He did not blame the wedding planner or claim it had been a misunderstanding. For the first time in many years, he simply acknowledged the truth. A few moments later, my mother slowly joined us. Tears glistened in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. When she asked whether that was really your seat, my mother whispered, "I suddenly saw the reception through someone else's eyes. I realized how many years you have quietly accepted being treated as though you should always take the smallest place in the room. I never noticed because I had become used to it." I looked at both of them with calm honesty. "I never wanted the biggest place in the room," I said. "I only wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere in it." Neither of them answered immediately because there was nothing left to argue about. Sometimes the hardest truths were also the simplest, and judging by the silence spreading through my family that evening, I was beginning to realize they were finally seeing me for the first time in years. When we returned to the reception, the atmosphere felt completely different, yet I refused to let the sudden attention change who I was. I had not come to my sister's wedding hoping for an apology or recognition. I had certainly not expected an extraordinary guest to reveal a chapter of my life that I had always considered private. None of it erased the years that had come before, and none of it gave me the desire to embarrass anyone. The distinguished woman resumed her seat beside me with the same calm elegance she had shown from the moment she arrived. Dinner continued, Conversations slowly returned, and the musicians began playing again. Little by little, the celebration found its rhythm. The difference was that people no longer looked through me. They looked at me. Several relatives who had barely acknowledged my presence earlier approached our table one by one. My Aunt Linda was the first. She smiled awkwardly before placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Claire," she said, "I had no idea about the work you have been doing. Your father told me a little while ago. I wish we had asked more questions over the years." I smiled sincerely. "There is still plenty of time for questions." She laughed quietly, relieved that I had not answered with bitterness. A few cousins followed, asking about the Literacy Foundation, the community libraries, and the volunteer programs. For the first time in years, our conversations were not centered on careers, salaries, or social status. They were simply conversations between family members. Even the older couple who had shared my original table came over before dessert. "We are very glad we had the chance to meet you before everyone else realized how remarkable you are," the gentleman said warmly. I shook my head with a smile. "I am not remarkable. I have simply been fortunate enough to meet remarkable people." The distinguished woman overheard my answer and quietly smiled to herself without saying a word. Emily remained near the dance floor for most of the evening, greeting guests with her husband, but I could see that her smile had become more thoughtful than before. Finally, as the sunset painted the sky with soft shades of orange and lavender, she slowly walked toward me. There were no photographers nearby, no guests gathered around us. For the first time all day, it was simply the two of us. She looked down for a moment before speaking. "I have been trying to figure out what to say," she admitted. "Nothing I have thought of feels big enough." I waited patiently. "When we were children," she continued, "I always wanted to be like you. Somewhere along the way, I became so focused on impressing other people that I stopped noticing the person who had always quietly supported me." She glanced toward the empty table that had once been beside the kitchen. "When I saw where you were sitting, I told myself it was just seating. Then someone from outside our family looked at it, and suddenly I realized what it actually said about how we treated you." There was genuine regret in her voice, not because of the distinguished guest's arrival, but because she had finally seen the situation through fresh eyes. I reached out and gently took her hand. "Emily," I said softly, "I did not drive 4 hours hoping to prove anyone wrong. I came because I wanted to celebrate your marriage." Tears formed in her eyes. "Can you forgive me?" she whispered. I smiled gently. "Forgiveness is easy. Rebuilding takes time. But time is something we still have." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. We embraced quietly, not because every wound had disappeared, but because healing had finally become possible. Nearby, the distinguished woman watched the moment with quiet satisfaction before turning her attention back toward the lake, allowing two sisters to begin writing a different story than the one they had lived for so many years. The evening slowly settled into the kind of peaceful celebration I had hoped for when I first opened my invitation weeks earlier. The music drifted gently across the lake. Children laughed while chasing one another near the gardens, and guests gathered beneath strings of glowing lights that reflected softly across the water. It finally felt like a wedding again instead of a silent lesson about belonging. Before leaving, the distinguished woman stood beside me one last time. She squeezed my hand with the same warmth she had shown throughout the years. "Promise me something," she said quietly. "Do not ever allow another person's opinion to determine where you believe you belong." I smiled. "I promise." She nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Because your place has never been decided by a seating chart." We shared one final embrace before her staff escorted her toward the waiting vehicles. This time, as she departed, every guest rose respectfully. Yet what stayed with me was not the admiration people showed her. It was the unexpected respect they had finally begun showing one another. My parents walked with me toward the parking area after the reception ended. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh flowers and summer grass. For several moments, none of us spoke. Finally, my mother broke the silence. "Would you come home for Sunday dinner next month?" she asked carefully. "Not because there is a holiday. Not because someone expects it. Just because we would like to spend time together." It was such an ordinary invitation, yet somehow it meant more than any elaborate apology could have. I looked at both of my parents. They seemed older than they had that morning, not because of age, but because humility has a way of changing people. "I would like that," I answered. My father smiled with visible relief. "Emily, and her husband joined us a few moments later. She wrapped me in another hug before I climbed into my car. "Next time," she said with a small laugh, "you are sitting beside me." I laughed too. "Next time, let us not worry so much about where anyone sits." She nodded. "Deal." The drive back to Ohio the following morning felt completely different from the one that had brought me there. The roads were the same. The distance was the same. Yet something inside me had quietly changed. I realized that I had spent years hoping my family would eventually see my worth, when the truth was that my worth had never depended on whether they recognized it. Recognition was comforting, but it was never the source of value. During the following months, our family slowly rebuilt what had nearly been lost. We did not become perfect overnight. Old habits occasionally resurfaced, and difficult conversations still happened. The difference was that we finally had those conversations instead of pretending nothing was wrong. Emily visited one of our literacy centers that autumn and spent an afternoon reading with elementary school students. My parents volunteered during our annual book drive before Thanksgiving. They did not do those things to impress anyone. They did them because they genuinely wanted to become part of a life they had never taken the time to understand. Every Christmas after that, a handwritten card arrived from the distinguished woman, always ending with the same sentence: "Continue choosing grace. It changes more lives than pride ever will." I kept every one of those letters in a small wooden box beside my desk. Sometimes people ask me what the most unforgettable moment from my sister's wedding was. They usually expect me to mention the extraordinary guest or the astonished expressions that spread across the reception. But that is not the memory I carry most closely. The moment I remember is much quieter. It was when I finally understood that respect cannot be borrowed from powerful friends, expensive clothes, impressive titles, or important introductions. Real respect begins the moment you quietly believe that your place in the world is already enough, even if someone else tries to seat you beside the kitchen. And once you truly believe that, no one can ever make you feel small again.